It's week 10, and that feels like something worth celebrating, right? This week, we are looking at the second part of our exam questions, the slightly tougher ones, the more detailed ones. We are looking at evaluate, analyse, and justify. I'm Miss Matt Mullen, and this is Macro Literacy. Last week we looked at identify, describe, explain, and summarise. This week we're moving on to 3 different words. So what is an analysis and how does it differ from the other words that we have talked about? Well, you're probably familiar with the abstract noun analysis from English. We tend to analyse, that's the verb, texts, kind of break them apart. So how is that different from the other words that we have looked at, from the other command words that we would find in an exam? Well, the etymology of analysis comes from ana, which means up, and luan, which means loosen. So this is from ancient Greek. It comes from the words that mean loosen up in Greek. Now that seems like quite an odd thing when thinking about analysing a text, but when you think about it, to loosen something up is part of breaking it apart. Other translations of this include untying. So if you can imagine a text or a problem as being a knot, then to untie or to loosen up is to break it apart and look individually at each of the sections. And that's what you're doing when you're analysing. You are breaking something apart and you're looking at the different parts and examining each and every one of them. So anything that asks you to analyse is going to be a longer response because you're going to be looking at each part of the thing that you're analysing and really starting to break that down and consider what it means and why it means it. You're bringing a lot of the skills that you would have in these other questions into it. You're going to identify things. You are going to explain them. You are going to describe them to a certain extent, but to analyse them goes further. It is to really look very, very closely. Now, when you're analysing really well, you are probably setting it up as an argument. So you are putting forward your own idea. So you're putting your own spin on it. It's not quite to justify, which is what we're going to talk about next, but it's similar. So you are talking about your beliefs in response to this, so it becomes a lot more personal. If I was to analyse a text, a piece of writing, a short story, I would start to look at the different sections of it. I would identify different parts of it and then discuss what the effect was, why the effect was that. And if I wanted to do it really well, I would set up an argument for the whole analysis that would link to each of those things that I identify and talk about why each of these has been done, and then they would all link back to my argument. So I might say this writer is trying to create the sense that spending money is bad and will always leave you feeling hollow. And then I would pick out different parts of the text that I think really epitomise that. I would identify the way that the writer has done this, talk about how they've done it, and then link it all back together to create an argument. So an analysis is getting more towards an argument, which links us on to our next word, which is to justify. Now this comes from the Latin originally justificare, and we'll remember that ficare meant to make. So justificare meant to do justice to, so to make justice. Justice is like being morally correct, having the right answer. Justice in general, we would talk about if somebody committed a crime, it would be balanced out by them being punished in some way or sent to somewhere where it would make sure that they didn't do the crime again. So that's justice. So if we are saying justificare, we're saying make justice, to do justice to something. So to justify is you backing something up, you making it right by explaining it fully. So justify doesn't just want you to look in detail at this idea, it wants you to give an opinion. All of a sudden you are the expert, you know everything. You're like a consultant right? And they're asking you to decide which one is better and explain why. Back it up. So, for example, say we're in a business studies GCSE and they say Hassan has a bakery. He can't decide whether he should open more shops or whether he should open an online shop because he wants to expand, right? So it's giving you these two options and it's going to say justify which course Hassan shall take. So you're going to pick one of those. You're going to pick whether he should open more shops or whether he should open an online shop. And you're going to back it up. You're going to give examples of why this is the right course to take, why this is something that he should absolutely do. I realise now that I'm talking about a bakery, so it's probably not ideal to have an online shop. I suppose it is because you'd like send things out. So maybe it's like, should he open more shops or should he like open an online delivery service? I don't know, right? I'm not a business studies person. That's what justify is. So justify is making you the expert. It's putting you on the spot. I'm forcing you to give an opinion and backed that opinion up. Now, you might use this in general life as well if you're like, you just have to justify your opinion, justify your beliefs. So justify, generally, quite a useful word. So evaluate is our final word, and evaluate is similar to justify, however it's speaking specifically about one problem. So you're presented with a problem and you are asked to evaluate the best response or course of action. So again, if we were talking about business, as I talked about in the last one, if you were asked to evaluate, it might say Hassan is considering hiring more staff for his bakery. Evaluate whether or not this would be a good decision. Now, in this case, you are usually asked to go much further. You are focusing just on that one decision and you want to look at all of the different factors that would come into it. You're going to decide what your opinion is based on that, and you're going to have a conclusion which is explaining which one you think is better and why. So this is similar to justify, however, rather than just picking between two, you are really looking very closely at one and exploring that until you've come up with a very specific decision regarding it. Now, you're going to have to evaluate in many situations in life. You're constantly having to evaluate what the best course of action is. If two of your friends are having an argument, you are going to have to evaluate whether it is best to side with one, the other, or whether to be a peacemaker, or of course, to just wash your hands of the situation. You're constantly evaluating because life is full of choices. But when you're asked to evaluate in an exam, they're asking you to back that up with lots of evidence as to why you have come to the decision that you have come to. And that brings us to the conclusion that is the end of this week's video. Now, in the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at different words that you would use in exams, and I've tried to keep it relatively loose. I've given you examples from specific subjects, but remember that depending on the exam board that your subject uses and which subject it is, these words will be used differently and will be used in various different exams. But generally the words do mean the same and the level to which you'll be going into detail will be the same. So hopefully you will have been adding dual codes as we go along, but if not, now is your time to do it. To remind you, a dual code is a symbol that for you sums up the word that you are talking about. So that doesn't need to mean anything to anybody else, it just needs to mean something to you. So if you haven't done already, if you now pause and create a little dual code, a little symbol for each of those words that will remind you in future what they are so that you can pop it next to any questions that require that skill in exams. And finally, that brings us to spelling. So, have a quick look at the spellings before I take them off the screen, and then you will be spelling each word yourself. Okay, so to start with, can you spell evaluate? Can you spell analyze? And can you spell justify? And here they are on the board. And then I'll take them off again. And once again, can you spell justify to start this time? And analyze. And evaluate. And here they are on the board again. Note that it's an S in analyze to finish it off because it is the English spelling rather than the American spelling. Check them. And then that takes us to our final go. So, can you spell analyze to start with, remembering which is the American and which is the English? I would like you to use the English spelling today. And then spell evaluate. And finally justify. And there they are back on the screen. So if you haven't done it already, if you could write down the correct spelling of the word along with the definition from what I said before and your own dual code, then that concludes our words that will be commanding you in exam section. And next week we'll be looking at just a few words from the top end of the mark scheme so that you can consider how to get there. And that is it for today. So I will see you next week. Thank you. Farewell. Goodbye. Thank you for joining us for another week on Macamore Literacy. If you enjoy starting with a word and then ending up in a rambling journey to who knows where, then I suggest that you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you just want to be a pal, like and subscribe. See you next week.